Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine two towns, identical in almost every way, same people, same culture, same geography, yet one is thriving, bursting with opportunity, and the other, well, it struggles with deep, pervasive poverty.
Right.
This isn't some hypothetical thought experiment. It's a real place, split literally by a fence. We're talking about Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
On one side, average household income is around $30,000 a year. Teenagers are in school. Public services like electricity and clean water are just taken for granted.
Yeah, the basics are covered.
Exactly. There's a predictable legal system. People can go about their lives without constant fear. But just a few feet away, on the other side,
A completely different story.
that income plummets to a third, infant mortality is high, roads are crumbling, and corruption is an unfortunate daily reality. What on earth creates such a dramatic difference across just a few yards?
It's truly fascinating, isn't it? Because this stark contrast
Yeah.
immediately challenges our sort of intuitive assumptions.
Up.
Well, the people on both sides of that fence share ancestors. They enjoy the same food, the same music, the same cultural heritage, really.
Right, they're basically the same people.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So the obvious explanation, as our source material makes clear, isn't about the people themselves. It's the border and what that border fundamentally signifies: radically different institutions.
Institutions.
Yeah. This micro example, it really sets the stage for a much larger global mystery we're exploring today. Why is Egypt so much poorer than the United States?
Or why did millions starve in North Korea while South Korea boomed, even though they started from pretty similar conditions?
Exactly. This isn't about natural resources or some inherent intelligence. It's about the very rules societies create for themselves, the rules of the game.
That's such a crucial insight. And this isn't just, understanding history for history's sake. It's about making sense of the world we live in now and what keeps billions trapped in poverty.
Absolutely. It has real-world implications today.
So today, we're diving deep into the core argument that it's man-made institutions, those rules and structures, not geography, not disease, not even culture, that determine a country's economic fate.
Right. We're going to look at how these political and economic institutions shape societies.
We'll examine historical examples of what the sources call extractive versus inclusive systems. We'll trace how small differences, these things called critical junctures, and feedback loops, both virtuous and vicious, drive nations toward prosperity or poverty.
Yeah, how these paths diverge.
Our mission today, to extract the critical nuggets of knowledge that help us understand the deep, often invisible roots of global inequality. So, okay, before we get to the core of what does work, let's tackle the theories that, frankly, don't hold much water.
Good idea. There are quite a few persistent myths out there.
For a long time, people pointed fingers at things like climate, the terrain, maybe even a country's cultural leanings. But our sources, drawing on extensive research, really dismantle these ideas. They show how misleading they can be.
Indeed, these widespread notions, while they might seem logical on the surface, often fail to stand up to historical scrutiny.
Right. They almost make it easier to dismiss the deeper, maybe more uncomfortable causes of inequality.
That's a good way to put it.
So one pervasive idea is the geography hypothesis, the idea that certain climates, like the tropics, are inherently less productive, maybe because of disease or, agricultural limitations.
Yeah, that's a common one. Think Montesquieu even.
But what's truly striking is how our sources reveal this dramatic reversal of fortune in many parts of the world, which directly contradicts this geographical determinism.
Precisely. Let's take the Americas. 500 years ago, when Columbus arrived, the areas south of the Tropic of Cancer, think the Aztec and Inca civilizations in modern Mexico, Central America, Peru, Bolivia, these places were significantly richer and more politically centralized than the Stone Age civilizations in what's now the U.S. or Canada.
So the Aztecs had complex money systems, writing.
Exactly. The Incas built vast road networks, managed famine relief. They were sophisticated societies. Yet today, the United States and Canada are vastly wealthier.
Wow. So the obvious fact of tropical poverty is, historically speaking, not obvious and not even a fact.
Not at all. It's a complete reversal.
And that reversal wasn't unique to the Americas, was it?
No, you see similar patterns elsewhere. South Asia, particularly the Indian subcontinent, and China were generally more prosperous than places like Australia and New Zealand before European contact.
And again, that situation dramatically reversed over time.
Right. Even within sub-Saharan Africa, regions that were sparsely settled before Europeans arrived, like South Africa, are now among the most prosperous nations in the region, despite other issues.
So the key takeaway here seems to be that prosperity isn't just about where you start geographically. It's much more about how a society organizes itself, right? Regardless of climate or initial resources.
That's it, exactly. Geography plays a role. Of course, it sets constraints and opportunities, but it's not destiny. It doesn't determine long-run economic fate.
It doesn't lock you in.
No. This directly challenges that geographical determinism, like Jared Diamond's emphasis on initial endowments of plants and animals, while those factors might influence the timing of things like agriculture.
Sure, the head start.
Yeah, the head start. But history clearly shows prosperity can flourish in diverse climates and then dramatically shift. It suggests geography isn't the primary, enduring determinant of wealth. It's about how societies adapt and organize through their institutions.
Okay, that makes sense. So geography isn't the main driver. What about the culture hypothesis?
Oh, yes, culture.
The idea that if a society values certain things over, say, hard work, innovation, individual initiative, then it would naturally stay poor. What do our sources say about that one?
Well, the sources highlight how cultural attitudes are often seen as, deeply entrenched, slow to change.
Right, people think culture is destiny too.
Yeah, exactly. Yet this theory struggles to explain rapid growth miracles. Think East Asia. Think China more recently. These places underwent profound economic transformations in a relatively short period. Culture didn't seem to hold them back then.
So culture can change? Or maybe it wasn't the main barrier?
Well, institutions can change, sometimes rapidly, and that change can then influence culture over time. It's a complex relationship. But if culture were the sole determinant, you'd expect a clearer correlation between specific cultural traits and economic outcomes.
Which we don't always see.
Which we often don't. Take Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. They have similar income levels today, broadly speaking, but they have vastly different proportions of indigenous populations. If indigenous culture itself was the primary factor holding them back, you'd expect to see much bigger economic differences based on those demographics.
I see. So the cultural explanation doesn't quite fit the facts either.
It's too simplistic, often. Not that culture doesn't matter at all, but it's rarely the main explanation for these huge differences in national prosperity.
Okay, this last one is particularly tough because you hear it a lot, especially in economic circles. The ignorance hypothesis.
Right, the idea that leaders in poor countries are just uninformed.
Yeah, that they simply don't know the right policies, or maybe they've received bad advice from economists. It assumes that if only the correct economic blueprint were provided, prosperity would follow.
Exactly. The ignorance hypothesis basically says, if economists just give the right advice, we can engineer prosperity.
Sounds appealing.
It does, but the experience of Ghana's Prime Minister Kofi Busia back in 1971 really illustrates the flaw here.
What happened there?
Busia was a democratically elected leader, well-educated, an opponent of the previous regime. He certainly knew the economically sound policies, controlling spending, realistic exchange rates, avoiding huge deficits.
Okay, so he wasn't ignorant.
Far from it. Yet he pursued unsustainable expansionary measures, kept price controls in place, policies that led to a major economic crisis, and eventually his overthrow.
Why? Why would he do that if he knew better?
Because those weren't choices made out of ignorance. They were, quote, good politics. They were used to transfer resources to politically powerful urban groups, people whose support he needed to stay in power.
So the policies that caused poverty were actually chosen on purpose to benefit certain groups.
Precisely. It raises the fundamental question, why do leaders make choices that create poverty? It's often not a mistake, it's intentional, because those choices serve the interests of the powerful, even if they harm the country as a whole.
Wow. Okay, so if we've peeled back these layers of common myths, it's not the lay of the land, not necessarily the culture, and not just leaders being ignorant, then what is it? What truly drives prosperity and poverty?
Well, this brings us to the core argument of our sources. It's all about how societies are structured. It's about their institutions. So at its heart, the core idea is pretty straightforward, really. A nation's economic destiny is shaped primarily by its political and economic institutions.
Okay, institutions, like the rules of the game.
Exactly. Think of them as the fundamental rules that drive everything: human behavior, investment decisions, innovation. They determine who holds power, who gets to make the crucial decisions, and how economic resources are ultimately allocated in a society.
Got it. So let's break that down. You mentioned political and economic institutions. Let's start with the economic ones. What do they cover?
Right. Economic institutions are the rules that determine things like who has property rights, how contracts are enforced, whether people can freely choose their jobs, start businesses, get loans.
Nuts and bolts of the economy.
Pretty much. Now, the key distinction is between inclusive and extractive economic institutions.
Yeah.
Inclusive economic institutions provide a level playing field. They ensure secure private property rights for a broad section of society, not just the elite. They offer an impartial system of law, so contracts are enforced fairly. And they provide public services like education, infrastructure that support broad participation, exchange, and innovation.
So they encourage people to get educated, develop skills.
Yes, they ensure that talent can rise regardless of background. Think of the patent system in the United States. It allows individuals from all walks of life, like Thomas Edison back in the day, to profit from their inventions. He held over 1,000 patents, founded GE.
Right, a huge incentive to innovate.
Or think about an accessible banking system that provides capital to entrepreneurs, allowing new businesses to start and grow. This is totally different from economies based on, say, forced labor, or where monopolies are granted to political cronies.
Okay, so if I'm, say, a poor person, but I have a great idea, an inclusive system gives me a real shot, right? I can get a patent without it costing a fortune, maybe get a loan to start a small business.
That's the ideal, yes.
Yeah.
It creates a path for upward mobility based on talent and effort.
But if those rules are rigged, like if licenses are super expensive or the bureaucracy is impossible or banks only lend to the well-connected,
Then even the most talented person might be blocked. Their potential is stifled by the system. That's the hallmark of extractive economic institutions. They're designed to extract resources from the many for the benefit of a few.
okay, that distinction is clear. Now, what about political institutions?
Political institutions are the rules governing incentives in the political sphere. They determine how governments are chosen, how power is distributed within the state and society, and crucially, whether that power is constrained.
So who gets to make the rules, essentially?
Exactly. And again, we see a similar split. Pluralistic political institutions distribute power broadly in society. Power isn't concentrated in the hands of one person or a narrow group.
Like checks and balances.
Yes, checks and balances are a key feature, but it's broader. It means multiple groups, interests, and segments of society have a voice and can influence political outcomes. This makes it difficult for any single group to just usurp power and create extractive economic institutions purely for their own benefit. Power is subject to real constraints.
So pluralism means power isn't just about who's in charge, but how that power is shared and limited. It rests with a broad coalition, making it harder for, say, a dictator or a tiny elite to just use the government to enrich themselves and their friends.
That's the core idea. In contrast, extractive political institutions concentrate power in the hands of a narrow elite and place few constraints on the exercise of that power. Think absolutist monarchies, dictatorships.
Where the rulers are above the law?
Precisely.
Yes.
And these different political setups have a huge impact on the economic institutions that emerge.
Ah, so they're linked.
Deeply linked. This is the key insights, the profound synergy between them. Inclusive economic institutions generally need inclusive political institutions to survive and thrive,
Why is that?
because those with political power ultimately decide the economic rules. If power is concentrated, the elite will likely create economic rules that benefit them, extractive economic institutions. But if power is broadly distributed and constrained, inclusive politics, it's more likely that the resulting economic rules will also be inclusive, offering opportunities more widely.
So it creates a feedback loop, a virtuous circle.
Exactly. A virtuous circle where broad political power leads to more equitable economic rules, which fosters prosperity, which in turn reinforces broad political participation and makes trying to seize absolute power less attractive.
But the flip side is a vicious circle.
Correct. Extractive political institutions' concentrated power lead to extractive economic institutions designed to siphon wealth upwards. This setup then reinforces the elite's grip on power, making change incredibly difficult. Poverty and repression become self-perpetuating.
So it's like a nation's path, its destiny almost, is being written by these initial rules. And once you're on one path, virtuous or vicious, it's really hard to jump tracks.
It is very hard. History shows these paths have remarkable persistence. The choices made centuries ago can still shape a country's fortunes today.
Okay, let's circle back to our starting point then, Nogales, because it seems like the ultimate illustration of how these institutions, not inherent differences, shape destiny. That fence, it is such a powerful image.
It really is. Standing there, you look north to Nogales, Arizona. Average household income, $30,000 a year. Remember, most
Mm.
teenagers are in school, good public health infrastructure.
And a government they can vote out that provides basic services.
Right. Accountable, at least
Yeah.
to some degree. Then you look south, just feet away, to Nogales, Sonora. Income a third of the U.S. side. Many kids not in school, higher infant mortality, poor roads, rampant crime, corruption.
It's night and day.
It is.
Yeah.
And the fundamental difference isn't the people, their culture, their shared ancestry. It's the radically different institutions of the United States versus those of Mexico operating on either side of that fence.
So it's literally the economic institutions in Arizona that allow people to choose jobs, get schooling, encourage investment, leading to higher wages.
Yes, combined with the political institutions that ensure those economic rules are generally stable and that the government provides essential public services because citizens demand them.
Whereas in Sonora, people face different incentives shaped by less inclusive institutions. Maybe higher barriers to starting a business, less secure property rights. Maybe success depends more on who you know.
That's often the reality under more extractive systems, yes. The rules benefit insiders.
So how did these two places, starting so close, end up with such different institutions? We need to go back, right? Back to colonization.
Exactly. To understand this divergence, we have to look back to the very beginnings of European colonization in the Americas. The Spanish strategy was profoundly different from the English one, largely because of what they found.
What did the Spanish find?
They encountered existing, highly centralized, and often already extractive states, like the Aztec and Inca empires. These societies had large, dense populations, established systems of tribute, forced labor, and existing hierarchies.
So the Spanish model was basically conquer and take over.
Pretty much. Conquer the leaders, capture the existing state apparatus, and insert themselves at the top of the hierarchy to extract resources, gold, silver, and especially labor.
Examples.
Think of the encomienda system. Spaniards were granted rights over indigenous populations, supposedly to convert them to Christianity, but mainly to extract tribute and labor.
Right. And the Potosi Nita.
Ah, the infamous Potosi silver mines in Bolivia. The Spanish adapted the existing Incomita system of forced labor drafts, compelling vast numbers of indigenous men to work in horrific conditions in the mines. It was incredibly brutal and deadly, but highly effective at extracting silver for the Spanish crown and elite.
So their focus was on exploiting existing wealth and labor systems. They weren't necessarily interested in settling places unless there was something to extract immediately, like in Buenos Aires initially.
Exactly. The first attempt to settle Buenos Aires failed, partly because the local Charruas and Querandi peoples were nomadic hunter-gatherers, not easily forced into labor, and there was no readily available gold or silver. So the Spanish moved on to areas with more exploitable resources and populations.
Okay, so that was the Spanish approach. What about the English in North America, like in Jamestown, Virginia? Did they try the same thing?
They certainly tried initially. The Virginia Company colonists attempted a similar strategy: capture the local chief, Wahunsunakak, and coerce the Powhatan Confederacy into providing food and labor.
But it didn't work.
No. Wahunsunakak's confederacy wasn't as centralized or easily dominated as the Incas. His people resisted effectively, even imposing a trade embargo that nearly starved the settlers. The English quickly realized there was no gold or silver, no existing state infrastructure to just take over, and the indigenous population couldn't be easily forced into servitude on a large scale.
So what happened then? This is where Captain John Smith comes in, right?
Yes, Smith became a pivotal figure. He recognized the reality. No gold, no easily coerced labor. His urgent message back to the Virginia Company directors in London wasn't for more soldiers or gentlemen adventurers.
He asked for workers.
Exactly. He pleaded for carpenters, husbandmen, gardeners, fishermen, blacksmiths, masons. He saw that if the colony was to survive, the colonists themselves would have to work, clear the land, build things, farm.
That's a fundamental shift in approach.
It is. And it led, over time, to a very different set of institutions. Because if the colonists themselves had to work, you needed to give them incentives. You needed to grant them land, secure their property rights, eventually give them more political say.
So this difference in initial conditions, dense, exploitable populations in states in Spanish America versus sparser populations, resistance, and lack of easy riches in North America created fundamentally divergent institutional paths.
That's the argument. The Spanish could impose highly extractive institutions, building on existing extractive structures, and these persisted for centuries, often leading to that reversal of fortune where once rich areas became relatively poor.
Well, in North America, the failure to impose extraction on the natives forced the English to eventually create more inclusive institutions for the settlers themselves.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily benevolent intent, it was often necessity. They had to build institutions that provided incentives for European settlers to invest their own labor and capital. This laid the groundwork for more secure property rights, greater economic freedom, and eventually more representative political institutions, at least for the colonists, a very different starting point than Latin America. So understanding how history unfolds is absolutely key here. It's rarely a simple straight line from A to B.
Right, it's more complex.
It's more like a dynamic dance between existing institutional setups, often involving only small differences between societies, and these sudden transformative moments the sources call critical junctures.
Critical junctures, like major shocks or events.
Exactly. Major events that disrupt the existing political and economic balance in a society. Things like plagues, revolutions, the opening of new trade routes, technological breakthroughs.
Okay, but you mentioned small differences first. What's this idea of institutional drift?
Right. Institutional drift is the idea that even if two societies start out pretty similar over long periods, tiny, perhaps even random, differences in their rules, norms, or power balances can accumulate.
Like genetic drift in biology.
That's a great analogy. Slow, often almost unnoticeable divergence over centuries. But these small differences, initially minor, can become hugely consequential when the society hits one of those critical junctures.
Because the society reacts differently to the shock, depending on its slightly different starting point.
Precisely. The critical juncture acts like a fork in the road, and the direction a society takes depends heavily on the specific institutional baggage it's carrying at that moment due to this prior drift.
Can you give an example?
The Black Death, the bubonic plague in the 14th century, is a perfect, though grim, example.
Right, you mentioned it earlier. Wiped out maybe half the population of Europe. A horrific event. Boccaccio's description in Florence. Chilling.
Truly devastating.
Yeah.
But it had this unexpected transformative impact on institutions across Europe, acting as a massive critical juncture.
As so, what was the situation before the plague?
Pre-plague, much of Europe was dominated by a feudal order. Kings, lords, and peasants or serfs tied to the land. Serfs performed unpaid labor, paid fees and taxes, couldn't easily leave. A highly extractive system for the benefit of the lords.
Okay, standard feudalism.
Then the plague hits. Suddenly, labor is incredibly scarce because so many people have died. This drastically shifted the balance of power. Peasants had unprecedented leverage.
Because landowners were desperate for workers.
Exactly. In Western Europe, particularly in England, peasants started demanding greater freedoms, higher wages, lower rents. Attempts by the state and the lords to stop these changes, like the Statute of Laborers in England trying to freeze wages.
They didn't work.
They largely failed.
Yeah.
They led to resistance, culminating in things like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Although the revolt itself was crushed, the underlying economic pressures were too strong, feudal labor services gradually dwindled, obligations were weakened, and a more inclusive labor market began to emerge, where workers had more choice and commanded higher wages.
So the plague, interacting with the existing situation in England, pushed it towards more inclusive labor institutions.
Yes, but here's where the institutional drift comes in. It wasn't the same everywhere.
What happened in Eastern Europe? They had the plague too, right?
They did. Same demographic shock. But in Eastern Europe, the lords were, perhaps, slightly better organized relative to the peasants. Towns were weaker, peasants had fewer outside options, and less solidarity. These seemingly small initial differences in the balance of power mattered immensely when the critical juncture hit.
So instead of gaining freedom,
workers in Eastern Europe saw their existing, already limited freedoms eroded even further. Landlords used their slightly stronger position to impose even tighter controls, restricting movement, increasing labor obligations. It led to what historians call a second serfdom.
wow. So the same shock, the Black Death, led to opposite outcomes. Freedom in the West, deeper serfdom in the East.
Exactly. By 1600, Western and Eastern Europe were institutionally worlds apart regarding labor, largely because of how those small initial differences interacted with the critical juncture of the Black Death. The outcome was contingent, not predetermined by the plague itself.
That's a powerful illustration of drift and juncture. A chilling thought, really. How a tragedy could trigger freedom in one place and tighten chains in another.
It underscores how contingent history can be and how much these institutional details matter.
Okay, let's fast forward. Another massive critical juncture you mentioned was the expansion of Atlantic trade, starting around the 16th, 17th centuries.
Yes, the opening up of the Atlantic routes after 1500 and especially after 1600, created huge new economic opportunities, trade in sugar, tobacco, slaves, manufactured goods.
A whole new world economy opening up.
Right. But how a nation engaged with this new world economy and who benefited had very different consequences depending, again, on their existing institutional drift, particularly their political structures.
How did England differ from, say, Spain or France in this?
In England, the monarchy, unlike the more absolutist monarchs in Spain and France, couldn't fully monopolize this new Atlantic trade.
Why not?
Partly because Parliament, even before the Glorious Revolution, already had some power to restrict royal actions, particularly around taxation and granting monopolies. The crown wasn't all-powerful. This meant that a new class of merchants, traders, and businessmen, many operating outside direct royal control, could emerge and profit immensely from this Atlantic trade. They became wealthy and independent.
These are the new men you mentioned earlier.
Yes, these new men, often based in growing ports like London, Bristol, Liverpool, resented royal interference, arbitrary taxes, and monopolies granted to court favorites. They started demanding changes in political institutions to protect their property rights and commercial interests.
And they became a powerful force.
A very powerful force. They played a critical role in the conflicts of the 17th century, including the English Civil War and ultimately the Glorious Revolution, pushing for a stronger parliament and limits on royal power.
So, in England, the crown's relative weakness, that slight institutional difference, meant it couldn't fully capture the benefits of Atlantic trade. This allowed a new, powerful group to rise, which then challenged the existing political system.
Exactly. In contrast, in Spain and France, the monarchs had much stronger control. They could monopolize trade more effectively, granting licenses and privileges to their favorites, extracting much of the wealth for the crown and the established aristocracy.
So the new trade opportunities didn't empower a broad new class to challenge the system in the same way.
Not nearly to the same extent. The wealth flowed more directly to the existing elites, reinforcing the absolutist structures rather than undermining them, so that critical juncture of Atlantic trade pushed England further towards pluralism, while it arguably consolidated absolutism elsewhere. Again, the outcome depended on the institutions already in place.
Okay, this logically brings us to a truly pivotal moment, maybe the pivotal moment in the story of inclusive institutions, England's Glorious Revolution.
Absolutely, 1688.
It wasn't just, swapping one king for another. Our sources argue it was a fundamental shift in the very fabric of power, a shift that laid the groundwork for unprecedented prosperity.
That's right. The Glorious Revolution saw Parliament decisively triumph over the king, King James II, effectively ending the threat of absolutism in England.
How did they make that stick?
Through documents like the Declaration of Rights, which became the Bill of Rights in 1689. This established core constitutional principles. Parliament determined the succession. Monarchs couldn't just suspend laws or impose taxes without Parliament's consent. No standing army without Parliament's okay. Crucially, real decision-making power shifted from the monarch to Parliament.
And Parliament now represented who?
It represented a broader coalition than ever before. Not just the traditional landed aristocracy, but also these increasingly powerful merchants, traders, and financiers, the new men enriched by Atlantic trade, alongside gentry and manufacturers. Their interests were now much more directly reflected in policy.
Okay, so Parliament gains power, representing these commercial interests more. How did that actually translate into tangible economic changes? What were the first things they did and who benefited?
Well, these new parliamentarians had a very strong stake in enforcing secure property rights and promoting commerce. One of the first things they did was gain control over taxation. They abolished arbitrary taxes imposed by the crown, like the hated hearth tax, which fell heavily on manufacturers.
And who paid taxes instead?
They shifted the burden more towards land taxes, impacting the traditional aristocracy. They also actively promoted mercantile activities, using the state, for example, strengthening the navy to protect England's burgeoning overseas trade interests. The Bank of England was founded shortly after, providing stable finance.
So this new political landscape quickly led to more inclusive economic institutions.
Yes, property rights became much more secure, not just for land, but also for other assets. Critically, this included intellectual property. The patent system was strengthened and made more systematic. This provided a major stimulus to innovation.
Because inventors knew they could profit from their ideas.
Exactly. They knew their rights would likely be respected by the courts and Parliament. At the same time, monopolies, which the Stuart kings had frequently granted arbitrarily to their favorites, were largely abolished or brought under parliamentary control, opening up markets to competition.
And this rationalization of property rights you mentioned earlier, did that help with infrastructure?
Yes, secure property rights made it easier to acquire land for essential infrastructure projects, building roads, canals, and later railways, which were absolutely vital for industrial growth, for moving goods and raw materials. Parliament actively passed legislation to enable these projects.
So this whole package, secure property, patents, fewer monopolies, better finance, infrastructure support, decisively changed the incentives.
Absolutely. Suddenly, innovators like James Watt improving the steam engine, Richard Trevithick building the first steam locomotive, Richard Arkwright developing the factory system with his spinning frame. These people knew their property rights would likely be respected. They had access to markets where their ideas could be profitably sold and used. Capital was available.
It seems almost inevitable, then, that the Industrial Revolution kicked off in England just a few decades after the Glorious Revolution fundamentally reshaped the institutional environment.
It's certainly no coincidence. The Glorious Revolution created the fertile ground, the institutional framework that made sustained technological innovation and industrialization possible and profitable for a widening group of people.
Now, you mentioned pluralism being key. Did this mean Parliament always acted perfectly, or just that power was dispersed enough to prevent total capture?
The latter, definitely. Pluralism doesn't mean perfect governance. It means power is contested, shared among different groups. So while parliamentarians would certainly protect their own interests, they couldn't easily shut out newcomers or completely block changes that threatened established players, because other groups also had influence.
Is there an example of this balancing act?
A fascinating one is the story of the Calicoes Act in the early 18th century. Domestic woolen manufacturers, a very powerful lobby, faced fierce competition from cheap, colorful cotton textiles calicos imported from India.
So they lobbied Parliament.
Successfully. In 1701 and again in 1721, Parliament passed acts banning the import and even the wearing of most Asian silks and printed calicos in England, protecting the domestic wool industry.
Okay, sounds like classic protectionism by an established interest.
It was. But that wasn't the end of the story. Because the acts inadvertently spurred the growth of a domestic cotton and linen industry, particularly in new industrial centers like Manchester, producing fabrics like fustian, which was a mix.
Unintended consequences.
Right. And when the established wool industry then tried to get Parliament to clamp down on this burgeoning domestic competitor, they failed.
Why?
Because the manufacturers in Manchester and other new towns now had their own clout, their own representation, their own allies in Parliament. They successfully lobbied for the Manchester Act of 1736, which protected the domestic fustian industry.
So Parliament, representing this broader coalition of interests, couldn't just grant an absolute monopoly to the wool industry at the expense of this rising cotton industry.
Exactly. This constant negotiation, this prevention of absolute monopoly by any single interest, was crucial. It meant that creative destruction, that essential process where new innovations displace old industries, creating winners and losers, wasn't entirely stifled by those with vested interests and political power.
So the system allowed new ideas and industries to emerge and challenge the old ones.
Yes, and that dynamism, enabled by pluralistic political institutions supporting inclusive economic ones, was fundamental to the sustained growth that followed. That's the virtuous circle in action.
Okay, so the ideal is this virtuous circle. Inclusive politics leading to inclusive economics, driving innovation and widespread prosperity, like post-Glorious Revolution England. But is it possible for nations with clearly extractive institutions to grow economically?
That's a crucial question. And the answer, according to our sources, is yes, it is possible. But, and this is a huge but, this growth is typically not sustainable in the long run and has fundamental limitations.
Why? What kind of growth is it?
It's usually growth based on reallocation of resources or on catching up by adopting existing technologies rather than sustained, cutting-edge innovation driven by broad participation.
Let's take an example. The Soviet Union often comes up.
The Soviet Union is a classic case study. Remember Lincoln Steffens, the American journalist? After visiting Russia shortly after the revolution, he famously declared, "I have been over into the future, and it works."
Right. And for a while, it seemed like he might be right, didn't it? The growth figures were impressive.
Astonishingly so for a time. Between 1928 and 1960, the Soviet economy under Stalin grew at an estimated 6% per year. That's incredibly rapid growth. It genuinely mesmerized many in the West. Even respected economists like Paul Samuelson in his famous textbook repeatedly predicted the Soviet economy might eventually overtake the U.S.
Wow. 6% a year for decades. So for listeners hearing that, it might sound like a success story, right? What was the real engine behind that growth, and were there hidden costs?
Great questions. The engine was primarily brute force reallocation and immense coercion, not sustained technological innovation in the way we saw in England.
Reallocation how?
Stalin's regime moved millions of people from agriculture, where they were often underemployed or inefficiently used, into industry. They poured capital into building factories, infrastructure, producing steel, tractors, essentially mobilizing underused resources on a massive scale.
Okay, so shifting resources to more productive sectors, that can drive growth for a while.
It absolutely can. But it wasn't driven by people freely choosing better jobs or innovating. It lacked sustained technological change because the entire system actively disincentivized real innovation.
How did it disincentivize innovation?
Well, think about the planning system. Factory managers were rewarded with bonuses for meeting output targets set by the central planners. Introducing a new, potentially better process or product was risky. It took resources away from current production, threatened the bonus if it failed, or took time to implement.
So better to just keep churning out the same old stuff.
Often, yes. Plus, targets were often ratcheted up. If you exceeded your target one year, your target for the next year would just be higher. This created an incentive to underperform slightly, to hide capacity, to avoid having impossible targets later. Not exactly a recipe for dynamism.
And you mentioned coercion.
Immense coercion. Under Stalin, laws made absenteeism or tardiness a criminal offense. Between 1940 and 1955, something like 36 million people, a third of the adult population, were found guilty of such offenses.
36 million. What happened to them?
Punishments range from wage cuts to hard labor. 15 million were sent to prison camps. The gulags, 250,000 were shot. Millions more exiled. It was growth fueled by fear and force.
So as the source notes, you cannot force people to think and have good ideas by threatening to shoot them.
Exactly. You could force them to dig ditches or assemble tractors, up to a point. But you can't force genuine creativity or innovation. So this kind of growth, based on reallocation and coercion without real Schumpeterian creative destruction, eventually runs out of steam. Once you've moved all the peasants to the factories, once you've built the basic industries using existing technology, where does further growth come from?
It plateaus.
It plateaus, stagnates, and can ultimately collapse, as the Soviet experience eventually demonstrated in the 70s and 80s. It's growth, but it's a temporary illusion, not built on sustainable foundations.
This sounds, well, it sounds quite relevant to some discussions about China's rapid growth today. China has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, incredible achievement, but operates under, let's say, non-pluralistic political institutions.
Yes. The sources explicitly discuss China as another potential example of significant growth under extractive political institutions. Deng Xiaoping's reforms starting in the late 1970s were crucial. They moved away from the extreme extractive economic institutions of the Maoist era.
How so?
They introduced market incentives, allowed private farming, opened up to foreign investment, encouraged private businesses, essentially incorporating elements of inclusive economic institutions. And the results, in terms of growth and poverty reduction, have been spectacular.
But the political system?
The political institutions remain fundamentally extractive, with power concentrated in the Communist Party, limited free speech, no real political competition.
So China has achieved massive growth by moving towards more inclusive economic institutions, but under persistently extractive political ones.
That's the argument. This allows for significant catch-up growth, adopting existing technologies from the West, mobilizing a huge labor force, benefiting from globalization. But it raises serious questions about its long-term sustainability. Can China make the transition to growth based on cutting-edge indigenous innovation without also reforming its political institutions towards more pluralism? History suggests that's very difficult.
Because true innovation often requires challenging the status quo, which extractive political systems tend to resist.
Precisely. Creative destruction is inherently disruptive, politically as well as economically. Extractive regimes often fear that disruption.
Are there other historical examples of this pattern? Extractive growth that eventually faltered?
Absolutely. Think about the Roman Empire. The Republic and early empire saw impressive economic growth, high agricultural productivity, vast trade networks, sophisticated infrastructure.
But it wasn't based on constant innovation.
Not really sustained technological progress, no. The economy relied heavily on slavery and the exploitation of conquered provinces. Innovation was limited, partly because the elite derived their wealth from land and conquest, not necessarily commerce or industry. and slavery itself dampened incentives for labor-saving inventions.
Didn't Emperor Vespasian reject an invention?
Yes, the story goes he rejected a new, more efficient machine for transporting heavy columns, supposedly saying, "You must let me feed my poor commons," fearing it would cause unemployment and social unrest. That fear of creative destruction, common in extractive systems, stifled long-term innovation.
And Venice, you mentioned it earlier, it started with innovation.
Venice is fascinating. It pioneered incredibly inclusive economic institutions early on, like the commenda, a type of limited partnership contract that allowed people from outside the traditional elite to invest in and profit from trading voyages. This fueled amazing growth and upward mobility.
But then came the economic serrata.
Yes. Around 1300, the established elite, feeling threatened by the success of these newcomers, effectively closed ranks. They passed laws restricting the use of commenda contracts, limiting participation in trade primarily to the established noble families, and making political office hereditary within that group. They basically shut the door behind them.
Moving from inclusive towards extractive institution.
Exactly. They monopolized both political and economic power. And what happened? Venice began its long, slow economic decline. The engine of innovation and broad participation stalled. It's a powerful lesson. Even societies that achieve inclusive growth can revert if political power becomes too concentrated and uses that power to block competition and change.
This fear, I mean, you mentioned the fear of creative destruction. The idea that new technologies or new ways of doing things could displace established economic privileges or even challenge political power seems like a really powerful recurring theme.
It's absolutely central. It explains why elites, even when they can see the potential benefits of progress for society as a whole, often actively choose to block it. They prioritize maintaining their own power and wealth over allowing broad-based prosperity that might threaten their position.
They say, not on our perf.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Let's take the Ottoman Empire. Printing presses using movable type were widely available in Europe from the mid-15th century, revolutionizing access to information.
But in the Ottoman lands?
A functional press printing in Turkish or Arabic wasn't officially allowed until 1727. And even then, its output was tiny and heavily vetted by religious and legal scholars. The first printer, Mutafarrika, produced only 17 books over 15 years. Meanwhile, Europe was experiencing an explosion of printed knowledge.
Was this because they didn't know about the technology? Ignorance again.
Not at all. They knew about it. It was a conscious decision. The scribes, who made a living copying manuscripts, and the religious scholars who controlled the interpretation of texts, saw widespread printing as a direct threat to their power, their influence, and their economic livelihoods. They actively lobbied against it.
So they blocked a technology that could have spread literacy and knowledge just to protect their own interests.
That's the interpretation, yes. Fear of the destabilizing effect of easily accessible information.
This fear extended right into the Industrial Revolution itself, didn't it? In places like Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire?
Absolutely. In these large agrarian empires dominated by absolutist monarchs and powerful landed aristocracies, industrialization was seen as deeply threatening.
Why?
It would create new cities, new factories, a new industrial working class potentially prone to rebellion. It would empower new groups, industrialists, financiers, who might challenge the traditional authority of the monarchy and the landed elite. It represented massive social and political upheaval.
So they actively resisted it.
Often, yes. Take Count Igor Kankrin, Russia's finance minister under Tsar Nicholas I in the first half of the 19th century. He epitomizes this resistance.
What did he do?
He actively opposed developing a proper commercial banking system to fund industry. Instead, state loans were funneled to large landowners, using their serfs as collateral, explicitly propping up the old system. He even banned the establishment of new cotton or woolen spinning mills in Moscow for a time.
Banned factories. And what about railways?
He famously saw railways as encouraging unnecessary travel among the masses, which he considered socially dangerous. He feared it would spread radical ideas and make people mobile and harder to control.
So these policies were deliberately designed not to foster industrial growth, but to keep society agrarian and preserve the power of the czar and the aristocracy.
Precisely. Protecting the existing extractive order was the priority, even if it meant falling further and further behind industrializing nations like Britain.
We see similar patterns elsewhere too, right? Ethiopia?
Ethiopia provides another stark example of enduring absolutism acting as a barrier. Until the revolution in 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie ruled the country essentially as his private property.
Through systems like the Galt system, what was that?
The Gult system was a form of land tenure, where the emperor granted control over large areas of land and the right to extract tribute from the peasants living there to loyal officials and nobles in exchange for their service and allegiance. It created no security for the peasants and concentrated wealth and power at the very top. Highly extractive.
And even the revolution didn't bring inclusive institutions.
No. The military regime that overthrew Selassie, the Derg, led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, simply replaced the emperor as the extractor. Despite initial socialist rhetoric, they reversed early land reforms, concentrated power ruthlessly, and continued to exploit the population. Ethiopia's deep poverty today is a direct legacy of this long history of absolutism and extraction.
Sometimes the barrier isn't an overly strong state, but the opposite, right? Like Somalia.
Exactly. Somalia represents the challenge of state failure, the lack of a centralized authority capable of enforcing even basic law and order.
How does that prevent development?
For centuries, Somalia has been characterized by feuding clan families and these social units called dia-paying groups, where members have mutual obligations for compensation if harm is done. This system, while providing some local order, constantly led to conflict between groups and prevented the emergence of a unified state that could provide security, enforce contracts universally, protect property rights, or invest in public goods.
So without that overarching authority, investment is too risky.
Extremely risky. Who would enforce a contract? Who would protect your factory or farm from being plundered? Development becomes impossible. People even move their villages away from roads to make plunder harder, effectively retreating from markets and trade. It's not just an absence of institutions, it's an environment actively hostile to inclusive growth.
And it's crucial to remember sometimes these extractive institutions aren't just homegrown. They can be deliberately imposed or intensified by outside forces, particularly colonialism.
Absolutely. Colonialism often led to a profound reversal of development in many parts of the world by installing or strengthening extractive institutions.
Can you give an example?
The actions of the Dutch East India Company in the Banda Islands, the Spice Islands, now part of Indonesia, are chilling. To establish a complete monopoly over nutmeg and mace in the early 17th century.
What did they do?
They massacred or enslaved almost the entire native population of the islands in 1621. Then they divided the land into plantations run by Dutch overseers, populated with imported slaves who were forced to cultivate spices sold to the company at fixed, low prices. Absolute extraction, imposed through extreme violence.
Horrifying. And the slave trade in Africa.
The Atlantic slave trade had devastating institutional consequences for Africa. It turned many African states and societies into war machines geared towards capturing and selling other Africans to European traders. This destroyed existing, often more legitimate, political structures, fostered endemic warfare and insecurity, and undermined the development of trust and broader economic activity. It left a legacy of weak or predatory states and extractive institutions that persisted long after the trade itself ended.
And South Africa is another key example of deliberately engineered extraction.
Yes, particularly after the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910. The white minority government systematically constructed institutions to control and exploit the black majority. The Natives Land Act of 1913 is infamous.
What did it do?
It legally divided the country, allocating 87% of the land to the white minority, who were less than 20% of the population, and restricting the black majority to the remaining 13%, often the least fertile land. This wasn't just about land. It was designed to prevent black Africans from becoming independent farmers and force them into becoming a pool of cheap, controllable labor for the white-owned mines and farms.
So it created what economist W. Arthur Lewis later called a dual economy.
Exactly. A deliberate institutional design to extract wealth in cheap labor by systematically denying rights and opportunities to the majority of the population. It wasn't natural economic evolution. It was conscious, extractive, institutional engineering.
So bringing this all together, the core argument is that the most common reason nations fail today, why they remain poor and unstable, is because they're stuck with these extractive institutions.
That's the central thesis, yes.
And the vicious circle often means that even when change happens, one extractive regime simply gets replaced by another. The faces change, but the underlying system of extraction persists. It's been called the iron law of oligarchy.
Yes. That's a term used to describe this depressing pattern where revolutions or independence movements that promise liberation end up just installing a new elite who take over the existing extractive machinery for their own benefit.
Zimbabwe, under Robert Mugabe, seems like a stark, modern example of this.
It's a tragic illustration. After independence from white minority rule in 1980, there was hope for a more inclusive future. But Mugabe's ZANU-PF party quickly consolidated power.
They replaced the old elite as the extractors.
Essentially, yes. Political institutions remained anything but inclusive. Opposition was suppressed, elections were manipulated, and economic institutions, while formally ending racial discrimination, continued to be used to siphon wealth towards the party elite and their allies.
And the economic consequences.
Devastating.
Yeah.
By 2008, Zimbabwe's per capita income was roughly half of what it had been at independence. Unemployment soared to an estimated 94%. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Basic services collapsed, leading to things like a massive cholera outbreak that killed thousands.
And Mugabe himself became a symbol of this extraction, right? The fake lottery win.
Right. In 2000, as his political grip seemed to be weakening, he publicly claimed to have won a significant state lottery prize. It was widely seen as a blatant symptom of his total control and willingness to plunder state resources. It also coincided with him unleashing violent land occupations and expropriations of white-owned farms, partly to reward his supporters and maintain power.
It's a brutal reminder. Simply changing who is in power doesn't guarantee a move away from extractive institutions if the underlying political and economic structures remain rigged. The new elite just stepped into the shoes of the old.
The vicious circle continues. Sierra Leone provides another tragic example.
The civil war there was horrific.
From 1991 to 2001, it killed around 80,000 people and utterly devastated the country. And its roots lie, again, in the persistence of extractive institutions after independence.
How so? What did the post-independence governments do?
They essentially took over and intensified the extractive structures established by the British colonial rulers. Things like agricultural marketing boards that paid farmers pitifully low prices for their crops, pocketing the difference. They also relied heavily on the system of paramount chiefs in rural areas, using them to control the population and extract resources, just as the British had done.
So the colonial structures weren't dismantled, just repurposed.
Exactly. And President Siaka Stevens, who ruled for much of the 70s and 80s, went even further. Fearing a military coup, he deliberately weakened the National Army and police, replacing them with paramilitary units loyal only to him, like the infamous State Security Division, SSD, known locally as Siaka Stevens' dogs.
This created a power vacuum.
It led to a near-total collapse of state authority outside the capital. This paved the way for rebel groups like the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, led by Foday Sanko, while they initially claimed political grievances against the corrupt elite.
They quickly turned to brutality and exploitation themselves.
Massively, especially in the diamond mining areas, engaging in horrific atrocities, amputations, massacres, and enriching themselves through control of the diamond trade. The state's extractive nature and subsequent collapse created the conditions for warlordism and further extraction by non-state actors.
So the vicious circle here involved unchecked power, leading to state decay, leading to even greater chaos, violence, and predation.
A truly vicious spiral. Guatemala offers a slightly different variant of the vicious circle.
How did it manifest there?
More as the remarkable persistence of the same elite, the descendants of the original conquistadors and colonial settlers, maintaining control over institutions across centuries to ensure their continued dominance.
So after independence from Spain,
they largely maintained the colonial extractive economic institutions' forced labor systems, unequal land distribution that benefited them. Even when economic opportunities changed, like when coffee became a highly profitable export crop in the late 19th century.
the liberal reforms that followed didn't bring inclusive growth.
No. Leaders like Manuel Estrada Cabrera and later Jorge Ubico, who was president from 1931 to 1944, didn't use the coffee boom to build inclusive institutions. Instead, they reorganized the economy and the state specifically to maximize the exploitation of coffee production for the benefit of the existing landed elite.
How?
They strengthened forced labor regimes to ensure a cheap supply of indigenous workers for the coffee plantations. They maintained highly extractive political institutions, suppressing any dissent. Ubico, much like Count Cancrin in Russia, was deeply suspicious of organized labor. He banned words like workers, labor unions, and strikes.
Why? Fear of industrial workers.
Fear that industrialization and organized labor would create new power centers that could challenge his rule and the dominance of the landed coffee elite. He wanted to keep Guatemala agrarian and easily controlled, protecting his and the elite's profits, even if it meant condemning the majority to poverty.
So even a potential economic boom like coffee can just reinforce the extractive system if the political power remains concentrated and unwilling to allow broader participation or creative destruction.
Absolutely. The new opportunities are simply captured by the existing elite within the old extractive framework.
Is this still happening today? Are there modern examples of states run this way?
Sadly, yes. Uzbekistan, under President Islam Karimov until his death, and arguably still today, is presented as a chilling modern example.
What's the situation there?
Cotton is the country's main export, but the entire sector is controlled by the government. Farmers are forced by the state to allocate a significant portion of their land, maybe 35%, to cotton cultivation.
Forced.
Yes, compelled by the state. And they're paid only a tiny fraction of the world market price for their crop. The government takes the vast majority of the profit.
And how is it harvested?
The harvest relies heavily on compulsory, unpaid or barely paid, labor, particularly mobilizing school children, university students, and public sector employees. Reports documented children as young as 7 or 8 forced to work long hours in the fields for 2 months a year, often in appalling conditions, missing school.
That sounds like modern-day serfdom.
It has strong echoes of it. And Karimov maintained this system through utterly extractive political institutions, fraudulent elections, total control of the media, ruthless oppression of any opposition. It epitomizes how extractive institutions directly cause and perpetuate poverty for the masses while enriching the political elite at the very top.
Even supposed reforms can sometimes reinforce extraction, can't they? Like privatization in Egypt.
That's another crucial point. In Egypt, particularly during the 1990s and 2000s under Mubarak, privatization programs, often encouraged by international institutions like the World Bank and IMF,
They didn't lead to competition.
they often became another avenue for politically connected businessmen, known locally as the Jutan, the whales, to acquire state assets cheaply and secure monopolies.
Any specific examples?
The sources highlight figures like Ahmed as a steel magnate who controlled something like 70% of Egypt's steel production, while also being a high-ranking member of Mubarak's ruling National Democratic Party. His companies benefited enormously from privatization and government protection.
So privatization just turned public monopolies controlled by the state into private monopolies controlled by cronies of the regime.
In many cases, yes. It was designed to enrich an allied business elite and shore up political support for the regime, not to genuinely foster competition, innovation, or broad-based prosperity. And this kind of crony capitalism fueled the deep public anger and grievances about corruption and lack of opportunity that eventually erupted in protests like those in Tahrir Square in 2011.
Okay, this picture of the vicious circle is pretty bleak. It seems incredibly powerful, almost inescapable. Extractive institutions just seem to perpetuate themselves.
They certainly have strong feedback loops that make them resilient.
But history also shows us that this iron law of oligarchy isn't absolute destiny, right? Some nations do manage to break the mold. They transition from extractive to inclusive institutions. How does that happen?
It does happen, although it's often a difficult, contested, and lengthy process. There's no single formula, but we can see patterns.
Britain is often cited as the classic example of breaking out, but it wasn't overnight, was it?
Not at all. Britain exemplifies a more gradual, virtuous circle. The Glorious Revolution in 1688 was a major turning point towards political pluralism, as we discussed. But the process of democratizing further and making institutions truly inclusive for the whole population took centuries.
So 1688 wasn't the end.
No, it was a crucial beginning. Power shifted to Parliament, but Parliament itself was initially dominated by a relatively narrow elite of landowners and wealthy merchants. The vast majority of people still couldn't vote.
So how did it become more inclusive?
Through a long series of reforms, often driven by pressure from below and conflict. The Peterloo Massacre in Manchester in 1819, where cavalry charged a peaceful crowd demanding parliamentary reform, showed the elite's initial violent resistance to opening up the system further.
Well, that repression didn't work forever.
In the long run, it proved unsustainable, partly because industrialization itself was creating new social forces and demands. The First Reform Act of 1832 was a major step. It abolished rotten boroughs with tiny electorates and gave representation to new industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham. It also broadened the franchise, though still based on property qualifications.
And more reforms followed.
Yes, subsequent reform acts in 1867, 1884, and 1918 gradually extended the vote to working-class men, and eventually in 1928, universal suffrage was achieved, including women on equal terms with men.
And this political inclusion went hand in hand with other changes, like education.
Absolutely. As the political system became more representative of ordinary people, the state began to provide more public services. The Education Act of 1870 committed the government to providing elementary education for all children, eventually making it free and compulsory. This investment in human capital was crucial for continued economic progress and social mobility.
So the key here was gradualism, each step contested, but maybe small enough not to trigger all-out resistance from the elite.
That seems to be a crucial element of the British experience. Gradual change reduced the stakes for the elites compared to, say, a sudden revolution where they might lose everything. It made compromise and incremental reform more likely, reinforcing the virtuous circle, where political inclusion led to economic inclusion, which then empowered more people to demand further political rights.
Okay, what about the United States? It started with more inclusive institutions, at least for white men, but it also faced challenges, right? The robber barons.
Yes, the U.S. experience shows that even nations with relatively inclusive foundations aren't immune to challenges from concentrated economic power, which can threaten to create a vicious circle.
This was in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Exactly. Figures like Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads, John D. Rockefeller in oil, Standard Oil controlled maybe 90% of refining, J.P. Morgan in finance. They built vast industrial empires and trusts, often using ruthless tactics to crush competitors. This led to huge monopolies and soaring wealth inequality.
Sounds like a move towards extraction. What stopped it?
Crucially, the existing inclusive political institutions allowed for a societal backlash. The free press played a vital role. Investigative journalists, the muckrakers like Ida Tarbell exposing Standard Oil's practices, informed the public and fueled outrage.
And this led to political action.
Yes, public pressure led to landmark legislation aimed at curbing monopoly power. The Interstate Commerce Act to regulate railroads, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and later, under presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and the breakup of huge trusts like Standard Oil.
So the political system was responsive enough to push back against concentrated economic power?
Yes, though it was a struggle. Even a very popular and powerful president like Franklin D. Roosevelt faced checks when he tried to pack the Supreme Court in the 1930s because it kept striking down his New Deal legislation.
Congress stopped him.
Congress, including members of his own party, blocked the plan. They feared it would undermine the separation of powers and set a dangerous precedent, a slippery slope towards excessive executive power. This demonstrates the resilience of pluralistic political institutions and the virtuous circle the system could correct itself, even when under severe stress from both economic concentration and a powerful executive.
Even deeply entrenched regional extractive systems can be broken, right? Thinking about the American South after the Civil War.
That's another critical example of breaking the mold, albeit through intense conflict and federal intervention. For nearly a century after the Civil War, the South maintained a highly extractive system aimed at controlling black labor.
Through Jim Crow laws.
Yes, black codes, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, enforced segregation, Jim Crow, and outright violence and intimidation were all used to disenfranchise black Americans and ensure a supply of cheap, subservient labor, particularly for cotton plantations. It was a regional pocket of deep extraction within the broader U.S.
What caused that to finally break down? It seemed incredibly stable for a long time.
A critical juncture emerged, really from the 1940s onwards, driven by several factors converging.
Like?
Increasing organization and activism among black Americans themselves, the civil rights movement, with figures like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless others demanding change. This combined with decisive intervention by the federal government, particularly the Supreme Court.
The court rulings were key.
Hugely important. Landmark decisions like striking down whites-only primaries in 1944, Brown v. Board of Education desegregating schools in 1954, and Baker v. Carr in 1962 establishing one person, one vote against legislative malapportionment. These systematically dismantled the legal pillars of the South's extractive system.
And were there economic factors, too?
Yes. The mechanization of cotton picking reduced the planters' dependence on cheap manual labor. And the Great Migration, the mass outmigration of millions of black Americans from the South to northern cities seeking better opportunities, also weakened the economic logic for the Southern elite to fight quite so desperately to maintain the old system. It was this combination of grassroots pressure, federal intervention, and underlying economic shifts that finally broke the mold.
It required that broad coalition, including pressure from outside the region.
Precisely. The inclusive federal institutions acted as a crucial lever against the regional extractive ones.
Can we see similar dynamics more recently? Brazil, perhaps?
Brazil's transition from military dictatorship to democracy and subsequent progress, particularly in the 2000s, offers another perspective. The sources argue this wasn't primarily engineered by outside advice or foreign aid.
What drove it then?
It was largely a consequence of diverse domestic groups courageously building more inclusive institutions, starting with political changes. The resurgence of the independent labor movement in the late 1970s, with major strikes in industrial centers like San Bernardo, led by figures like Lula da Silva.
That merged with other movements.
Yes, emerged with a broader societal reaction against military rule involving professional associations, parts of the church, student organizations, human rights groups, forming a powerful, broad coalition demanding democratic change.
So this grassroots empowerment, translating into national political change, was crucial.
Absolutely. It led to the end of the dictatorship, a new democratic constitution in 1988, and eventually to governments more committed to expanding public services, reducing inequality, like through the Bolsa Familia program, and creating a more level playing field. It highlights again how crucial broad coalitions are for forging and sustaining inclusive institutions, contrasting perhaps with places like Venezuela, where democratization didn't lead to the same kind of stable pluralism. So pulling all these threads together, our theory, the framework presented in the sources, offers a powerful way to understand the vast inequalities we see across the globe, from these deep historical divergences to very contemporary challenges.
And it emphasizes that this whole process isn't simple, it's not predetermined.
Exactly. The path of institutional change is highly contingent. History matters profoundly. Those small differences interacting with critical junctures can lead societies down vastly different, often unpredictable paths.
So there's no guarantee that, say, the Arab Spring protests in Egypt's Tahrir Square would automatically lead to inclusive institutions.
No guarantee at all. Extractive institutions have a tendency to recreate themselves, maybe with new faces in charge, but the underlying structure remains. The iron law of oligarchy is a constant risk. Similarly, while China's economic transformation is remarkable,
Sustained growth and true convergence with the wealthiest nations might be unlikely without fundamental political transformation towards pluralism.
that's the implication of the theory. Sustained, cutting-edge innovation seems to require the openness and creative destruction that inclusive political institutions foster and protect. Growth based purely on catch-up eventually faces limits.
Which means we can't just engineer prosperity from the outside by giving good economic advice to leaders, like the ignorance hypothesis suggests.
It seems highly unlikely to work if the underlying institutions aren't right. The incentives and constraints faced by leaders within their existing political systems are paramount. They'll often choose policies that maintain their power, even if those policies hinder broad economic progress.
Think about foreign aid efforts.
Exactly. Experience with foreign aid, particularly in states with deeply extractive institutions like Afghanistan or Somalia, often shows that simply injecting money or technical advice can be ineffective or even counterproductive. It can prop up corrupt regimes, bypass local capacity building, and undermine the very institutions it ostensibly seeks to help if the fundamental power structures remain extractive.
So what is key for successful transitions? If external blueprints don't work, what does?
A crucial factor, highlighted repeatedly, is the empowerment of a broad coalition within society. It can't just be one narrow group seeking to replace the existing elite. A broad coalition encompassing diverse interests is more likely to demand genuinely pluralistic political institutions that constrain power and protect rights widely, rather than just setting up a new form of extraction.
And the role of information seems vital here.
Hugely important. A relatively free and independent media plays a transformative role. By providing information about abuses of power, corruption, or policy failures, it helps citizens understand what's happening. It also helps coordinate demands for change, making it harder for extractive regimes to suppress opposition or maintain control through secrecy and misinformation. Information empowers mobilization.
So at the end of the day, it really comes down to people organizing, demanding change, ensuring their voices are heard, and having access to accurate information to do that effectively.
That seems to be a core element of successful transitions towards inclusivity, yes.
This whole deep dive then, from Nogales right at the start, through the Black Death, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, the struggles for civil rights, it all points to a really powerful truth, doesn't it?
What's that?
That our collective destiny, the prosperity or poverty of nations, is largely shaped by the institutions we build or fail to build, and crucially, by how inclusive or extractive those institutions are.
I think that captures the essence of the argument very well.
So this raises a final question, really, for you, our listener listening in right now, thinking about your own society. What are the subtle ways that institutions, Political rules, economic regulations, maybe even social norms might be either fostering that virtuous circle of widespread opportunity or perhaps inadvertently contributing to a vicious circle for certain groups, holding them back.
Yeah, understanding these dynamics isn't just some academic exercise. It's a vital tool for engaging critically with the world around us, for recognizing the real levers of change or the real barriers to it.
Think about it. From that small border town, Nogales, to global empires across history, the narrative of human prosperity and poverty seems to be written not primarily in our geography or our culture or even our resources.
But in the choices societies make.
Exactly. In the choices societies make consciously or unconsciously, gradually or suddenly, about who holds power, how that power is constrained, and ultimately for whose benefit that power is wielded. What small institutional differences that exist today might, when faced with the critical junctures of the future, lead us towards new reversals of fortune, or perhaps, hopefully, towards new, more resilient, virtuous circles of prosperity for everyone.